This is an antique potions book, if I ever saw one.
As you can see, it's been hand bound with string and the whole thing is handwritten. It's a collection of medicinal recipes and it's titled Food as Medicine.
So for example, radishes contains many of the minerals and a very useful appetizer. Horseradishes, good for asthma, dropsy, rheumatism. Cherries, very good for Bright's disease. At other points, the ailment is the heading, and she's written down what foods you can eat to heal that disease. There are home remedies for insomnia, for rickets, for rheumatism.
The one for insomnia recommends that you drink fruit juice before bed, and that's likely because of digestion.
There's so much in here on indigestion and preventing indigestion, which is very typical of the Victorians and Edwardians. If you remember that classic line in A Christmas Carol where Scrooge sees the ghost of Marley and goes,
"You could be a piece of undigested beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There is more gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are."
Because in the 19th century, there was this big belief that if you didn't digest your food properly, then you could have hallucinations. In many ways, this book here is a commonplace book because it's got so much information on different themes. There are the 16 elements contained in foods, which she goes through. She's got the digestion time of different foods, which, by the way, is totally inaccurate. Like, apples boiled is put down as 2 hours 30, when today we would say it's about 30-40 minutes. And you can definitely imagine this being used as a point of reference from day to day. We will try to date this in just a moment.
But first, and because it's Halloween, let's talk about witchcraft. I have a question for you.
What is the difference between a recipe book, especially a medicinal recipe book, and a potions book? Because I would argue that this object here is related to the history of potion making and witchcraft. Okay, so let's think about the word potion. It derives from the Latin word potio, which means drink or to drink. And by the 12th century, the French version of this word had evolved into something you drink, a draught, specifically a medicinal drink. A potion is something medicinal. This is from 1475, when R. Higden writes in Polychronicon, he received a potion of Philip, his physician. So in that example, we see a potion being administered by a physician. They don't call it a medicine, they call it a potion. But why is that important? Because that is exactly what we see here, food as medicine. So there are so many examples of women making their own recipe books to use in the home. I've seen quite a few in my time in archives, and they really are incredible because often they will have little kind of food and water stains on them. They've obviously been used. My absolute favourite example, and one that I was lucky enough to see, was Lady Grace Mildmay's book, which was written in the late 16th century. She was very interested in herbalism. She had her own herbal garden, and as a girl she was interested in herbals. This is Gerard's Herbal, which was published in 1587 and was very popular. Inside is just filled with so much information about herbs and their different uses. But aside from reading these books, Lady Grace Mildmay created her own, and she's got these incredible Ramus charts and notes about what different herbs can be used for, very much like what this does. Margaret Boscawen is another example from the 17th century, and we also find something similar in the Clifford family library. And these books would be passed down through generations. There is a reason that they remain. They've been kept by generations, and they're a way to kind of pass on knowledge, in the same way that maybe a great grandmother has passed down a recipe to you. And even in here, like alongside the foods that we've got, there are herbs that are mentioned too. So for example, senna paste. Senna was a natural laxative that's been used for centuries. There is also cowslip and dandelion, two flowers which also occur in Lady Grace Mildmay's writings. So Vila Pena, wonderful article, explores the link between herbalism and witchcraft. He looks at tales of witchcraft, especially in folklore, and how herbalism is represented through these. Explores that link between women as custodians of ecological knowledge, and how, quote, medicinal plants are often depicted as sources of power or danger within these narratives. So when we have these stories of women using herbs in order to solve an ailment, when they're using herbs as medicines, in literature, in folklore, this is presented as a dangerous thing, as something which is kind of fantastical and strange and doesn't make sense, and which we should be scared of. So let's think about probably the most famous example of witches in classic literature, and that is Macbeth's Three Witches. And I'm just going to read you that famous section where they are brewing a potion.
Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
fillet of a fenny snake, in the cauldron boil and bake, eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blind worm's sting, lizard's leg and howlet's wing, for a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell broth boil and bubble, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Now, like, that sounds kind of terrifying, right? I remember reading this for the first time and loving it because it was so spooky and it was so strange. The wool of the bat, the tongue of the dog, like, these are horrible images, and it's one after the other. It's very uncanny, it's very uncomfortable, it's also kind of spectacularly disgusting. But let's break this down, because even though it feels dangerous, of course it feels dangerous, it's actually not that far removed from herbal remedies that women would be making within the home, and the kind of old version of this medicinal book that I'm holding. Like, we've all seen these images of the cauldron, and it's become the symbol which is very much connected to witchcraft. Like, you go out shopping for Halloween and a cauldron is one of the decorations that you're likely to see. We see it too even in 17th century woodcuts, where you have like images of witches standing around a massive cauldron, like kind of the image that we have in this part of Macbeth. But a cauldron is a cooking vessel, which would have been in many domestic homes in the 17th century. It's just a big boiling pot. It's where you make soup, it's where you make stew. It's very domestic in its use. Like, all it is a cast iron big pan. And yet it's become this terrifying witchy thing. A cauldron is literally, like, a cauldron is very domestic and very associated with like women's domestic expected work. Aside from that, all of these ingredients can actually be equated to different herbs. So wool of bat, for example, could be moss, could be holly leaves. Tongue of dog could be hound's tongue, which is a highly toxic plant. Blind's worm's sting could be a poppy seed or wormwood. And suddenly, when you abstract this, it's just herbs. They're brewing plants. But they've got all of these strange, fantastical names which make them feel dangerous. Like, this essentially is an image of women stood around a domestic cooking vessel and they're cooking different plants. Like, that's not hugely different from somebody making a soup for their family. So one of the examples that Villa Pino writes about is Marguerite Laurent, who was a 17th century woman who was accused of witchcraft, herbalism witchcraft. Marguerite had supposedly put a powder in her husband's food when she was making his dinner, and this was because he beat her the day before. Quote, "Their responsibilities for providing food and drink made it all too easy to explain how they had slipped in a poisonous diabolical powder." There is a level of anxiety, I think, whenever we accept somebody's cooking. Like, when somebody cooks a meal for you, you have to trust that they are giving you something with best intentions. Like, because you can't know what somebody's put in there. It's like the Roald Dahl story, The Lamb to the Slaughter. That is a horrible, like, kind of uncanny story which completely toys with your mind, because the policeman doesn't know what he's eating. He, like any of us, accepts food and we don't know what we're eating. The image of witches brewing potions from these strange, unidentifiable herbs in domestic cookingware speaks, I think, to the vulnerability that we experience when we accept somebody's cooking. Especially if wool of bat and tongue of dog are being mixed into the cooking pot. I mean, any of us would be concerned, because these are terms that not everybody knows. And this becomes scary when we are not part of that language game, when we don't understand what those words mean and what they're referring to. I mean, remember that the main fear around witches does come from them as transgressive figures, as people that normative society doesn't understand, people who seem like outsiders, and that's why they're a threat, because there is this like unknowability, this ineffability to witches. Like, fear of witches very much comes from a place of ignorance, but also this fear of witches, this fear of potion making, speaks to a wider fear which we see among men in the 17th century, this fear of women coveting knowledge, of women knowing things that their husbands don't know that they know, and it's a fear that we see dramatized and staged in plays of the 17th century. The witch's potion and the idea of the potion is historically interesting because much of the fear around this is around not knowing what women know. It's about women having knowledge, and in some ways it does speak to a fear of female education, which I think is why it's such a significant history. So this book is an example from a woman who, like many women through history, have used natural remedies to treat medical maladies within the home.
So I would say that this object is at least adjacent to the history of witchcraft and could be called a kind of potion book. It is really important to remember that not all herbalists were demonized though. Not all people who brewed herbal remedies were deemed witches. Like Lady Grace Mildmay was a herbalist and she knew a lot about herbs. However, she wasn't criticized for being a witch. She was very respected. Anyway, as I say, I wanted to try and date this because I bought it from somebody on eBay in America, and he bought it from a yard sale and has no idea about when it was written. So let's look at the book and see if we can find a way to date this. Okay, first clue. This has got hole punches. The hole punch was invented in 1886, so we know that it's after 1886. There is also a mention of Tabasco. I thought Tabasco was quite modern, but Tabasco sauce was sold on the market as early as 1870, so that gives us no extra information. She does, at the end, use the word pathogen. I'm going to search that up. Pathogen was first used in 1880. Again, I don't really think that narrows it down. There is also the phrase, feed a cold, starve a fever. However, she's arguing with this, which means that it must already be an established saying, but I don't know when it was first used. It was first used in John Whittle's 1574 book, so that doesn't tell us anything else. There is also a mention to bran tea, and this is a little bit more useful. Bran tea is mentioned very early in 1849 in a letter from Charlotte Bronte. She writes, "The pains return, but I combat them steadily with pitch plasters and bran tea." However, as I'm looking into this, it looks like it was more popular in the early 1900s. I found a recipe for bran tea, in brackets for a sore throat, which is in August 1907, and I have found a recipe for it in a 1920s recipe book as well, under Drinks for Invalids and Children. However, it does look like it's more popular pre-1920, which is making me think that this is maybe 1900 to 1920. Another hint, she says with this recipe to put it through the food chopper. Food chopper makes me think 1920s because it feels like quite a modern invention. However, a brief look shows me that food choppers were like a common staple even in the 1900s, and there is one here on eBay, a universal food chopper from 1900. So what my tactic so far has been, when does it have to be after? Like there are some words that didn't exist until a certain year, so it has to have been after that. But some of the language is also very old-fashioned, and that's going to kind of be what lets me date it earlier if it is earlier than 1920. So one of the words in here is neurasthenia, but I know from separate research that this was very much related to like hysteria. It was used in a lot of the writing around hysteria in the 1880s and 1890s. The OED says that by 1948 this was an outdated term. So in 1948, the Observer wrote, "From those once despised causes which passed under names such as neurasthenia," and that's very nostalgic. It's saying that it's not a word that we'd use now. So basically, in short, it doesn't tell us anything. Female complaint is another thing which is mentioned here, and that is again an old-fashioned term. So first used in 1757, the OED says, and then there's an example from 1908, and the next example after that is the 1990s, at which point it's nostalgic. The OED has these amazing frequency charts by using Google Books to study the frequency of word use. These charts are so interesting, but they are copyrighted, so I can't show you. But when we look at this chart for female complaint, we see that it reached its peak in the 1880s and 1890s, which again points to how this is quite an old-fashioned term. The other one is dyspepsia, which is an old word for bad digestion, and in the OED the last use was 1862, and again looking at the frequency charts we see that this word reached its peak in 1850 and was barely being used by 1900. The main thing though that I will cite is this is very scientifically advanced, especially for a home remedy document. So she mentions, for example, the 16 elements in food, which is like oxygen, hydrogen, silicon. She says nitrogen in air and water, especially rich in nuts. But one thing which is markedly absent from this is the word vitamins, and vitamins were only discovered in 1900. The first OED use is in 1912, however, and vitamin A was only discovered in 1913. This makes me think, therefore, that it was written pre-1912. I feel like if she'd known about vitamins, she would have put this in. So I think this is pre-1910. It's always really fun to try and date documents if you can. You can use handwriting too as a way to do it, and it's just like a fun investigative project. It makes you feel like a detective. But I hope you enjoyed this video. This is absolutely gorgeous, and if you have any cool manuscripts lying around your house, please send me pictures, because I love seeing things like this. And family archives are such a rich resource for like research and finding cool things, and I'm so grateful that I was able to happen across this one on eBay. But thank you for watching, and I hope that you have more than just a productive week.